Hello folks, and welcome back to the next video in this iRacing Essentials series. Today the focus is going to be on Windows settings. A couple of areas that I want to talk through. We'll start with some of the monitoring apps that I use, some that are actually built into Windows, and some third-party apps as well that I find super useful when you're trying to optimize the system. And then beyond that, we're just going to run through some of the Windows settings that when I set up a PC for the first time, or when I'm just doing, let's say, some general maintenance, or there's been some big Windows updates that I'll check back on in just to make sure that they're set up in the most optimized way for sim racing. Now the video falls in this iRacing Essentials series, but actually the content should be quite relevant for any other sim racing titles as well. All right, let's jump in. So to get started, I just wanted to focus quickly on the monitoring apps that Windows has built in, and then also a third-party app that I use quite a bit as well. These can be super useful to double check that the system's running in the optimal settings, or at least the settings that you think it should be running in for your particular sim. They typically shouldn't be running when you're racing because any resource monitoring apps tend to take away some performance from either the CPU, GPU, or a little bit of both because they're polling the GPU and CPU in order to get some of this information. But if you are doing a bit of a test session, you were testing out, say, new graphics settings or new Windows configuration, whatever it might be, these are good apps so that you can stick on, run in the background just whilst you're doing some tests, just to make sure that the system is running as you want it. First one to take a look at will be Resource Monitor. So I'm just going to bring that up really quickly here. This is an inbuilt Windows application. I appreciate this is just going to be a little bit small for you. It's a kind of an old looking app. There's a couple of tabs here at the top. So you've got Overview, CPU, Memory, Disk, Network. It's all fairly self-explanatory. It's going to give you information around each of these resources and tell you kind of what's going on with each one of them. CPU, I think, is most likely to be the most useful from a sim racing perspective. Now, on the right-hand side, you can see all these graphs, and that's basically the graph of each CPU. So it starts with CPU 0, and for me, it's going to go all the way down to CPU 15. This is the way I use this app, is to take a quick look at the CPU cores. And for me, I want to make sure that none of these cores are in parked status. Now, it will depend on the CPU that you're running as to whether having parked cores is good for sim racing performance or whether having parked cores is actually bad for performance. I'm not going to get into the different variations here. There's lots of great information online, so do your research. But often if you've got a CPU which has, say, some efficiency cores, having those parked can be useful when you're racing because it means the performance cores are doing the heavy lifting. But for my CPU example, that is not the case. I want all of my cores active and available to the sim. And so as you can see here, all of these cores are active. If I was to have a core parked, it would be flagged here in just the title where it says CPU and then the number right after it. It'll point out that it was parked and it would be grayed out. So that's the main usage that I get from Resource Monitor, but you can get into things like looking at the memory allocation. You can look at how the disks are performing in terms of the read, the write, the total, and you can even take a closer look at the network as well. But as I said, CPU monitoring is what I find most useful for the Resource Monitor app. Next up, it'll be Task Manager. Most likely this will be one that you've already pretty familiar with, as it's easy to get to. If you didn't see that, it's just a right click from the taskbar, Task Manager. And again, this shows you all sorts of stuff. Where I come for just to double check kind of things are working correctly. Again, as I jump to the second tab, which is showing me CPU, memory, disk, Ethernet, etc. It's quite similar to Resource Monitor in some ways. It's just visually a little bit easier to see what's going on. For this particular one, I quite often use this just to double check that the RAM that I have, so the system memory, is running at the speed that I think it should be, and that it's seeing all of the RAM within Windows. So I'm running 64 gigs. Great, we can see that here. And I also know the speed that it is overclocked to should be 6,000 megatransfers per second. So that's great. It also shows you, in use, committed, available, cached, all of the good stuff, which is great. But for me, Task Manager is just a really great tool just to double quick check, what's my memory usage, but more importantly, is your memory running at the advertised speed or the speed that you programmed it to in the BIOS? Next up would be Event Monitor. I'd wager that this might be an application that you are not as familiar with. Again, it's built into Windows. And the reason that I like this, and once you get into it here, if you can just see in the top right-hand corner, I'm hitting Event Viewer Local, and that's going to kind of give you a summary view of all the events that are taking place. This is always running in the background in terms of this logging is taking place constantly, which is great. So you don't need to have Event Viewer running for it to be collecting the information that I'm going to show you. But what it does is it collects information about when critical errors occur, warnings, information, audit success. Now, we don't really care so much for audit success, information, and to be honest, warnings as well. But errors and critical would be interesting events to take a look at, especially during the time that the sim is running, just to see if you've potentially got any failures that are happening and then the system is recovering from, or just to get a sense of what exactly is happening with your system from a failure perspective whilst the sim is running. So it'll tell you the source, and this is not always super intuitive in terms of what it means. And a lot of these errors, are quite common within Windows and are not necessarily things that you need to worry about. The good thing for me, I've had no critical errors in the last 7 days, which is good. A critical error will often result in a system shutdown, so you'll probably know about it. But I have been in the sim quite a bit recently, and so we can take a look and see, okay, well, which of these errors might be caused by the sim. Let's have a look at this one. So we've got Certificate Services Client. So Microsoft Pluton cryptographic provider was not loaded, blah, blah, blah. Probably not an error we need to worry about. It seems to be happening with a degree of frequency every 1 or 2 hours, but it's to do with certificate services. Okay, probably not sim related. Might be something for me to take a look at some point. But here's where I'm getting the most errors, this kernel event tracing log. In the last 24 hours, 125. I was in the sim quite a bit yesterday. Now, I happen to know that this Cloud Files Diagnostic Event Listener is to do with OneDrive, so I'm not worried about that. I actually typically have OneDrive off when I'm in the sim. But this error here, it's extremely confusing, gives you very little information, but I think it is to do with the easy anti-cheat that's installed. I've done a ton of research on this. I can't work out how to clear this error. It doesn't seem to result in an issue where the sim shuts down or whether I have any blue screens of death, so that is good. But it is frustrating, and this constantly runs every time I'm in the sim, and you can see here it's pinging an error almost every minute or so. So it's probably not great for performance, but it doesn't really seem to impact the running of the sim. And as far as I know, this is just a common issue with EAC on Windows 11 if you have the 24H2 update installed. So it's frustrating, but I've researched it. Not much I can do about it at this stage. But the reason for taking a look at Event Viewer is if there's any hardware failures or software failures that are happening whilst you're running the sim, they'll be logged here and they're useful to take a look at. It might suggest that something is incorrectly configured on the system, or maybe a fresh reinstall of either iRacing or Windows might be required if you're getting some critical errors that are happening all the time. So a useful resource to know. Doesn't need to be running whilst you're in the sim. It's constantly keeping a log of basically errors or critical issues with your system whilst it is running. And last but not least, let's take a look at a third-party app that I use sometimes just to check how the system is performing whilst I'm in the sim. And the program is called HWiNFO 64. Now, there are tons of third-party monitoring apps. Do your research. This is one that I've always enjoyed using. I find it has lots of detail. It's updated regularly by the developer, which is fantastic. And it's not too heavy-duty on your system. However, I would only have this running in the background really when I'm in a test session. This isn't something I'd have running when I'm in a race situation because it will pull a little bit from resources, be it CPU or GPU, because it's effectively monitoring all of these temps and values from what's going on across your system. But if you've made a major configuration change or software change or a brand new install of Windows and you're just trying to make sure everything is running correctly, it can be great to jump into the sim, run a test session and have this running in the background. It can be logging all of these values from a minimum and a maximum perspective. And it's a great way to keep an eye on temperatures, just to make sure the system is up and running effectively. So What a program like this does is it basically anything that it can read from the system, it will give you that data on. So this is talking about the virtual and the physical memory we have here. It's talking about my CPUs, the 9800X3D. It's giving me the core clocks. It's talking about the different residency or the C-state residency states of the CPU cores, whether they're going into the right, power down modes, I guess, when they're not being used. You can see C6 residency. This is when the core is in a deep power down mode, which can be good because it'll keep your temperatures down, etc. It shows memory timing. So if you've adjusted memory timings in the BIOS, you can double check in Windows that they are running correctly here. You can also do that in Task Manager. And probably what this is most used for, from my perspective, is I use it to keep an eye on temperatures. So this is my current CPU temperature. We don't have the game running, so it's running in kind of like the mid 40s, which is pretty standard. And then if we scroll all the way down to the bottom, this is my 5090, and again, probably the key thing for me to look at here would be temperatures, and it's similar to the CPU. So as I said, this is a really powerful monitoring program. There's a free version which doesn't lack any functionality, but it does impact system performance. So if you are going to run this and you're going to use it just to see how the sim is performing, recommend only doing it in a test or a practice session, and I wouldn't have it running in a race session. You can do, but just know it's going to eat away a little bit of your FPS. Might not be huge, but enough that you might notice some jitters because it is working pretty hard to just keep all of these values up to date. The final thing I've got relates really to Windows health, and this is something that I do maybe once a month, if I remember, once every 2 months. It's certainly not essential for keeping your system running cleanly. Windows does a pretty good job of looking after itself. However, Windows installations and files can get corrupted over time with multiple installs, deinstalls, and there's a little program that you can use here just to clean that up for you, and it doesn't take too long to run. You need a command prompt to run it. So you're going to go command prompt. You're going to run it as administrator, otherwise it won't run correctly. And the command line is sfc, and then it's /scannow. This, depending on your system, might take a couple of minutes, might take a little bit longer, but this is effectively doing a verification of all of the Windows files that are on your system. And if it finds that any are corrupted, it will replace them with the correct file. So as I said, not something you need to do on a particularly regular basis, but I often will do this when there's been a big Windows update or maybe even a big iRacing update, and I just want to make sure that Windows is operating as effectively and as optimized as possible. So just good housekeeping tasks to do every now and then. And I almost forgot, but I do just want to include this one last piece of advice and another app that I use, not on a regular basis, but certainly when I do a fresh install of Windows, I find this app extremely powerful. The app is called RevoUninstaller. I use the portable version of the app, so it doesn't actually install anything on my PC. This app is think of it as a more powerful uninstaller than the one that you have with Windows, because it can uninstall all of the programs that you see in apps on Windows. So if I was going in here to settings, to apps, installed apps, it can uninstall all of those, which is great. But it is also smart enough to be able to uninstall particular Windows apps. So if you have Windows apps that have been installed by default, maybe some of those games or whatever else comes pre-installed these days, RevoUninstaller can pull those off for you as well, which I think is extremely powerful. Now, the reason this is better actually than the Windows uninstaller, even for these regular applications, is it won't just uninstall the program, it will hunt down all of the program's registry entries and it will clean those as well, if you want to, as you go through that. So I'm not going to go through the whole process, but you just select here, you'd hit uninstall, it'd uninstall whatever software you've selected, but then it will also give you an option to then delete all of the register entries that are associated with that particular application. So again, just kind of keeps your system as clean as possible. So a great tool. I love it. As I said, once you've got your system set up and stable, probably you don't need to use it very often, but when you've done a fresh install of Windows and you've got all of that bloatware that's loaded on in the background, this is a great and easy way to clean it up just once and for all, and then you don't have to worry about it from then on. Okay, let's jump into some Windows settings that, if adjusted correctly, can just give you a little bit more performance whilst you're in the sim. We'll start off by heading into Security Center, so the little shield in your taskbar. And if you are using Windows 11, memory integrity, and again, just to show you how I got there, device security, core isolation details. Memory integrity by default usually is switched on. So if you've got a new PC or you've just rebuilt a PC, this may already be switched on. Now, do your research before turning this off. It can potentially, increase the, security risks on your PC. So depending on how you're using PC, if you're using it for work as well as racing, you might decide that you'd prefer to have this memory integrity setting switched on. So please, health warning, do a bit of research around this before you decide to turn it off. However, if you do turn it off and you're comfortable with the slightly increased security risk, it will give you a little bit more FPS because this is a little bit of a drain on game performance. So I'm comfortable with it off, so I've set it off. And when I tested it pre and post, it wasn't a huge difference, but it was maybe, 5 to 10 FPS when I was in game. So this is the first thing that I always double check is set to off. And again, you'll find that in the Windows Security Console. Next up will be the power profile in Windows, and this honestly, even for me, is still a little bit of a black box at the moment, and I have spent hours and hours online trying to research. And annoyingly in Windows, I think this is the same in Windows 10 and 11, there's really two different places to configure the power profile, and both have slightly different impacts. So I'm going to go to the control panel first, which is kind of the classic way of adjusting this. Go into System and Security, then I go into Power Options. Now you'll see in here that I've got three power plans. If I open up this one, high performance, power saver, and balanced. Now my recommendation here is to set this to balanced unless by default, when you've either built your PC or bought one, there's a specific power plan that's recommended by the OEM. And if so, and that's already selected, great, leave it at that. But the reason I recommend leaving this to balanced is typically this is allowing, say, the Intel or the AMD processor to use the optimal settings in order to get the most out of the processor. If you put it on what seems logical, which could be high performance, then that might be pushing all the cores to be running at a higher clock all of the time, could increase heat, and it could actually potentially result in a bit of less performance in the game, which does seem counterintuitive. So my recommendation is set this to balanced or leave it on whatever the default is when you bought your new system. However, the second setting when it comes to power that I recommend taking a look at, we'll go to System, we'll go to Power. And again, there's power modes in here as well. And it's kind of like a secondary selection. And you'll see in here, I actually have this selected to best performance. So in control panel, it's kind of like the master power plan setting. I have it set to balance, but then when I'm in the Windows settings, I set this to best performance just to make sure I can get the most out of the CPU. As I said, this is still a bit of a mystery to me. I don't know why we would have these two different controls, but in the research that I've done, this seems to be the best combination for gaming in terms of having the balanced power plan selected in control panel paired with the best performance selected in system and power in Windows settings, just to be able to get the best performance from the processor whilst you're gaming. Next up is game mode, another slightly confusing setting and one that I didn't adjust really for the couple of years since I started sim racing, but did adjust it at the beginning of this year. So if we go into gaming, again, Windows settings, you'll see there's a number of options, but there's one here called game mode, and you'll see that I've got game mode set to off. By default, this is almost certainly set to on, but here is the health warning when you set it to 1. The way that game mode is designed to work is to prioritize the sort of processors that are connected to the particular game that you're running. And that's great if you're only running that single game. But the reality is, with sim racing, you often have companion apps that are running at the same time. Maybe you've got overlay apps running at the same time. And even Discord or OBS if you're streaming. And so my take on this is if you're running additional third-party applications whilst you're in the sim, switch this to off and just let the CPU manage those processes on its own without interference from Windows. I stumbled across this setting when I was having real struggles getting my overlays working effectively on my triple 4K panels. Switching this off made a big difference and just made everything more smoother in the sim, and it got rid of a lot of the stuttering that I was experiencing when I was trying to run those overlays. So unless you're running just iRacing and nothing else, my recommendation is come in here, switch game mode to off, and just allow the CPU to determine which apps need which performance and when, because they do a great job of managing it with modern CPUs. For this next one, we are going to go back to the control panel. One day, all of these settings will just be in Windows settings. That'll make things a little bit easier. Specifically here, we're going to go actually back to the power options. And then we're going to click this, choose what the power buttons do. We don't really care what the power buttons do, but what we do care about is this fast startup. So I'm going to just click this button here so that I can adjust these. Now, by default, typically turn on fast startup is set to on. The reason that I turn this off, mainly because if you have fast startup on, it just keeps some of the things in memory, some of the processes in memory. So it's not necessarily a clean reboot unless you do an actual restart of the PC. Whereas if you turn off fast startup, every time you shut down and reboot is like doing a restart. It'll load all of the drivers, all of the processes fresh every time. I think when you're sim racing and doing any competitive gaming, you want to make sure that all of the processes are fresh and running effectively. You don't want to have any legacy issues from your last session that then get loaded back in just because Windows is trying to load that little bit faster. The difference in loading times for me when I turn on my PC is minimal. I mean, seconds at absolute most with modern CPUs. So yes, by default, this will be on. I would come in here and turn it off if you use your PC primarily for gaming. So the next setting I want to take you through is not necessarily going to apply to everyone, although for all of you that are running triple screens, this is something I would consider, whether you're running triple, 1080, 1440 or 4K, this would be a setting to consider. The reason I say that, if you're running triple screens, obviously, regardless of the resolution, you're putting quite a bit of strain on the GPU. Now, this setting refers to if you've got other apps that are running whilst you're in the sim, like maybe you have, a browser window open, maybe you've got OBS running, whatever it might be, some of these third-party apps or companion apps that you use will also have a toggle around using graphics or hardware acceleration. Now, that's great if the GPU isn't already fully utilized, but I know in my use case with triple 4K, I really want nothing else touching the GPU whilst I'm racing other than iRacing, as best as I can manage. And so the one thing that I do, and I do this for Discord, I do this for OBS, and I do this for Edge, my browser window, is just make sure that any graphics or hardware acceleration toggles are set to off. Now, if you're using your PC, multiple use cases, you might not want to change this, and if you're not running triple screens, this probably isn't such a big deal. But if you do experience occasional stuttering, this can be something to try to just see if it makes things a little bit better. So I'm just going to show you where this setting is on Microsoft Edge, but just know it's a similar setting that you can find in OBS, Discord. I think Race Labs, my overlay app, has it too, and again, I turn it off for that app too. But here, if I go down to System and Performance, Graphics Acceleration, you can see it's highlighted for us there. Use graphics acceleration when available. I have this set to off, and to be honest, if I watch videos actually in the browser, they're quite choppy because they're not using the GPU. But what I know it's doing is it's preventing Edge from using the GPU to do anything whilst I'm in the sim, which is absolutely what I want. So as I said, think about your use case, whether this is something worth doing for you. But if you're running triple screens, this might be something to consider, especially if you're suffering from occasional stuttering. So just a couple of things left before I close out the video here. First is file syncing software. Now, if you're using Windows, almost certainly you'll have OneDrive installed unless you have purposely taken it off. Now, I have OneDrive set to not automatically start with Windows. I do use it. It looks after my iRacing folder, but I select when to switch OneDrive on because I don't want it doing syncing whilst I'm in the sim. There may be some clever way for it to stop syncing every time I open the iRacing sim. I haven't really looked into it. I'd rather just not have OneDrive running at all unless I trigger it to run myself, because it doesn't really provide any advantage, whilst I'm running the sim. But if you do have other file syncing software, think of something to do with Google or just other file management software, just bear in mind that if it is running whilst you're in the sim, and especially if it's looking at your documents folder, then it can just be causing additional writes and reads whilst you're in the sim, and anything like that can potentially be a cause of a stutter. So my advice would be either uninstall them if you don't need them, do as I do and just manually choose when to switch the apps on and when to use them, or at the minimum have them running in the background, but just make sure you pause them before you jump in the sim, just to make sure that they're not interfering at all whilst you're in the race. And finally, we have startup programs. Obviously, if you're using your PC for work and play and whatever else you might be doing, you could have a bunch of other programs installed, and a number of those programs could be kicking off processes or apps when you start Windows. Now, some of that might be fine, but you at least want to make sure that you know what those programs are and that they are worth having running in the background whilst you're in the sim. Because if they're not, or you can manually start them later, again, it's just less resources, that are being used from a RAM perspective or a CPU perspective, just to give that smoother experience. So you can just search for startup apps in the start menu. It's going to bring you right there. I work really hard to keep this list to an absolute minimum, and you can see here there's only 4 apps listed. I have OneDrive set to off, so I trigger when that runs, as I said earlier. Windows security notification icon, fine, no problem with that being up and running. And then I just have my Garage 61 launcher that launches when I switch on Windows. So I'm very diligent about making sure I don't have anything in this list that I don't need to be running whilst I'm in the sim. But your use case could be different. Maybe you're doing content creation on the same PC as you're racing on, and if so, great. But just keep an eye on some of those other programs like Adobe or Logitech, stuff to do with keyboards. So many of those programs have companion apps or companion processes that will kick off every time you start Windows. This is a great way just to switch off the ones that you don't need, and again, hopefully all contributes to just a smoother in-game experience. All right, that is all I've got for you on this video. Unfortunately, Windows just continues to get more and more bloated, but with the end of support for Windows 10 on the horizon, I think it's October 2025, it's going to be really important to know how to keep your system running at its most optimal on Windows 11. So if you're just about to move to Windows 11, or maybe you've been on it for some time, hopefully there's been a couple of things in this video that you might not have been familiar with that you can play around and just see if it improves performance whilst you're in the sim. Now, up next on the channel, we're getting towards the end of this season from an iRacing perspective, and they have now committed to the new in-sim UI to be dropped in week 13. So most likely, at some point in week 13, I'll get into that. I'll have a play with the in-sim UI. I'll try and learn it as quickly as I can, and likely that's probably going to be the next video where I kind of just focus on the changes, see what improvements they've made, see what some of the challenges still are, but that's something I've been super excited about, honestly, ever since I got into iRacing, because it's felt like a really outdated piece of the sim. So super excited to jump into that, and once I've learned it and feel like I know enough about it, I'll get back on here, I'll create a video on it, and I'll give you my thoughts on it. But until then, have a great rest of the week, and I will catch you in the next one.